Let's jump right into it. Today we're taking a deep dive into something absolutely fundamental to being human: rules. We're not just talking about laws or government regulations. Think about that entire intricate dance between diverse individuals and the complex systems of rules they create, live within, and, well, constantly push against.
It's a truly universal phenomenon, isn't it? You see rule following, rule making, rule breaking everywhere.
Yeah, in every culture, every age group, throughout history.
Right? It spans everything from, the unspoken norms of how we stand in line to the foundational principles of international agreements.
And our source material for this deep dive is a really fascinating stack of articles and research. Some of it touches on concepts from a piece called Algorithmic Agora, AI and the Universal Science of Human Rules.
Right.
These sources explore why rules exist in the first place, what makes us decide to follow or break them, and the profound impact these systems have on our lives.
So our mission really is to pull out the most important insights from these sources. We want to look at this fundamental human-rule interplay through a new lens, that of artificial intelligence.
And discover what this deep dive means for you as an individual, for society around you, and maybe even for our entire planet.
Exactly.
So here's the question that kicks us off. Why are rules so essential to us? Why do we see evidence of formal rules going all the way back to those ancient legal tablets from Elumbla, 2400 BC?
Incredible, isn't it?
And there's still a cornerstone of something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights today. And what new, maybe even surprising things can we, looking at this ancient human behavior through the eyes of modern AI, reveal about ourselves and the structures that shape our lives?
Let's start digging.
Okay. To really understand rules, the sources suggest we have to go back to our deep roots biologically and evolutionarily. They make the case that rule-governed behavior isn't just something we invented later. The capacity for it is actually tied to our evolution.
So it's kind of hardwired into us. Well, the potential is there, Think about concepts like kin selection, favoring relatives.
Right.
Or reciprocal altruism.
Yeah.
Cooperating with the expectation that others will cooperate back. These are evolutionary strategies that rely on implicit or explicit rules of social interaction.
Like sharing food or figuring out who does what job.
Exactly. Humans are described in the sources as remarkably altruistic primates, and this complex social living wouldn't be possible without at least basic rule systems setting expectations.
And our brains must have played a pretty big role in letting us develop more complex rules.
Absolutely. The significant expansion of the human brain, particularly the neocortex, was key. It allowed for much more complex social thinking, language, abstract reasoning, all of it.
Gave us the tools, basically.
Right. The mental tools to formulate, communicate, remember, and enforce much more sophisticated rules than other primates could manage. The sources even float this intriguing idea, similar to how we seem wired for language with the universal grammar, that there might be an evolved social grammar, a kind of built-in predisposition or blueprint that helps us create and navigate rule-based systems.
A kind of universal wiring for rules.
Yeah.
Like a template.
Potentially. And looking at this through the lens of AI, that's interesting. By analyzing vast amounts of cross-cultural data on norms and rules, AI might actually help us map out what that underlying universal structure looks like.
It could reveal the common patterns beneath all the diversity.
Precisely. See what's really fundamental.
That's fascinating, this deep biological basis. So when did we start moving from these inherent tendencies to formalizing rules into actual written law codes?
Well, that brings us to the historical journey. The formalization of rules is tightly linked to major societal shifts.
Like farming.
Especially the Neolithic Revolution, yeah. When humans started settling down, farming populations grew, you suddenly needed much more sophisticated rules.
Right, for land ownership, irrigation.
Resource distribution, managing bigger, more complex groups, more people and more resources means more potential for conflict if there aren't clear guidelines.
Makes sense.
Exactly. And the invention of writing around that time accelerated this legal evolution dramatically.
Because you could write them down.
Once you could write rules down, they became more stable, easier to transmit, less open to immediate reinterpretation.
Right.
And we see the earliest evidence for formal law codes from places like Abla around 2400 BC, followed by hugely influential codes like Hammurabi's, the Roman Law of the 12 Tables.
Justinian's Code.
Justinian's Code, or the Tang Code in China, yeah.
It really puts that Abla discovery into perspective. Nearly 4,500 years ago, people were writing down laws.
It highlights how ancient that drive is to codify behavior. And the sources discuss something called path dependency in legal evolution.
Path dependency.
Yeah. New laws rarely emerge from nowhere. They build on existing frameworks. Roman law, for instance, profoundly influenced the civil law systems used across much of the world today.
Ah, I see.
So this process means that sometimes outdated norms or assumptions can get carried forward in surprising ways.
So decisions made thousands of years ago can still subtly shape the rules we live by today. Wow.
Precisely. And AI could be incredibly useful here, tracing those historical layers through vast legal texts, showing us exactly how past decisions continue to ripple through and influence contemporary structures.
Okay, so beyond the biology and history, there's a fundamental philosophical question here, isn't there? Why do we even need rules? What justifies them?
This delves into the fundamental justifications the sources explore. One major philosophical tradition is natural law theory.
Natural law.
Yeah, this idea suggests that true law isn't just whatever a ruler says. It comes from nature, reason, or even divine providence. There are universal moral principles, discoverable through reason, and just laws must align with these.
Like inherent human rights or fundamental moral truths that exist independently of any government.
Yes, that's the core idea. Cicero, for example, saw law as originating from what nature gives humanity, serving as a reformer of vice and an incentive to virtue.
So it provides a kind of moral benchmark for rules.
Exactly. A moral compass for evaluating rules. Are they truly just in their core?
And the other major tradition.
That's social contract theory, linked to thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau.
Okay.
This perspective suggests that individuals, perhaps originally in a chaotic state of nature, agree to give up some of their absolute freedom to a governing authority.
In exchange for safety and order.
In exchange for security, order, and cooperation, yeah. Rules, then, are the terms of this fundamental social contract established for mutual benefit and peace.
So rules are basically the operating manual or the terms and conditions that allow society to function and keep us safe from each other.
Effectively. Both traditions, though they approach it differently, are grappling with a core tension that runs through all rule systems.
Which is,
how do you balance individual liberty with the need for collective order? Rules constrain freedom, and philosophers wrestle with defining the limits and nature of those constraints, seeking a balance point.
it reflects that deep human quest for legitimate authority rules that feel right to follow.
Exactly. The quest for rules we can believe in.
And rules aren't just secular laws passed by governments. Belief systems play a huge role, too.
Absolutely crucial. Religious doctrines, from early tribal practices to organized global faiths, have been incredibly powerful sources and enforcers of social norms. As societies scaled up and became more complex, especially after the Neolithic period, shared belief systems were vital for binding together larger groups of unrelated individuals and lending legitimacy to authority and their rules.
Thinking about things like the Ten Commandments or principles found in Islamic Sharia or Confucian ethics.
Exactly. These often provide comprehensive moral codes that become deeply embedded social norms, guiding daily behavior.
And the belief that someone or something is watching.
The belief, present in many faiths, that supernatural agents are monitoring behavior and might dispense rewards or punishments can be an incredibly potent force in promoting pro-social actions and deterring selfishness, even when no human is watching.
So religion acts almost like a societal operating system that links adherence to these rules with a sense of purpose and communal identity.
That's one way the sources describe it. It links adherence to these belief systems with transcendent values and group identity, making the rules they contain very resilient and influential.
Okay, bringing in a completely different lens now.
Yeah.
The sources also mention logic and math, like game theory.
Yeah.
How does that fit into understanding rules?
Right, game theory. It's all about looking at strategic interactions where the outcome for any one person depends on the choices everyone involved makes.
And social life is full of those.
Absolutely. Rules, in this context, basically define the playing field. They define the available strategies people can choose from and what the potential outcomes or payoffs are for each choice.
Like that classic example, the prisoner's dilemma.
Perfect example. It shows how if everyone acts purely out of self-interest without rules or norms promoting cooperation, they can actually end up with a worse collective outcome than if they had cooperated.
Right.
Conversely, game theory can show how cooperative rules or norms can emerge and persist over time because they become stable strategies like a Nash equilibrium.
A Nash equilibrium.
Yeah.
where nobody gains by changing their strategy alone.
That's it, where no player can improve their situation by unilaterally changing their behavior if everyone else is sticking to the cooperative rule.
So rules don't just persist because someone enforces them with punishment, but partly because in certain situations, it strategically makes sense for people to follow them for a better outcome.
That's a key part of it, their inherent strategic logic. And mathematical models of social evolution formalize how these behavioral rules or strategies spread and stabilize within a population.
And AI can help with these models.
Significantly. AI can enhance these models, handling much more complexity and vast amounts of data, potentially helping us identify more efficient or stable sets of rules for a given social interaction.
This leads us nicely to the core concept mentioned in the sources, the science of human rules. What exactly is this field they're proposing, and how does AI help define it?
This is presented as a really ambitious, interdisciplinary study, one that's significantly informed by the capabilities of AI. It's essentially about how societies use rules not just as restrictions, but as sophisticated information systems.
Okay, information systems.
Yeah, they convey expectations about how people should behave and signal what the consequences will likely be if they don't. And they're also control systems, regulating behavior, coordinating action, and distributing resources.
So rules are like the communication and control layer of society, telling us what's expected and managing interactions.
Exactly. And the sources emphasize its universality. It applies to what they call all possible rules. This isn't just human law. It's everything from the implicit laws of nature, like gravity, to social norms, ethical codes, and yes, explicit international law. They suggest there's a deeper science to how all these different types of rules function.
So it covers a huge range.
It does. The sources offer a typology covering categories like natural law, positive law, social norms, ethical codes, laws of nature, highlighting that despite their differences, they share fundamental functions related to conveying information and regulating behavior.
And AI helps us see the underlying patterns across all these different rule types, like the common threads.
Precisely. AI can identify principles of effectiveness, fairness, or how rules adapt that might apply across these seemingly disparate domains, insights that are difficult for humans working only within one discipline to spot. It looks for the universal principles underlying these systems.
Okay, let's zoom in on us as individuals. How do we actually interact with these rules on a fundamental level? What's happening in our brains?
The neuroscience. Our brains are incredibly adept at navigating rule systems. Research highlighted in the sources points to the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, as crucial here.
The front part of the brain.
Right. Specific parts, like the mid-DLPFC, seem particularly involved in initially acquiring rules and spotting regularities in our environment.
Learning the patterns.
While the FPC helps integrate these new rules with everything else we already know.
So that's where we literally learn the rules of the game.
Yes, that's the primary learning center. Once learned, applying the rule involves other areas, too. The entire PFC is vital for higher-level functions essential for following rules.
Like?
Things like making decisions, planning future actions, and controlling impulses.
Now, I remember hearing that the PFC develops relatively late in life.
It does, continuing its development well into adolescence and even early adulthood. This delayed maturation is actually suggested in the sources as a partial explanation for why younger people, whose impulse control and planning centers are still developing, might show higher rates of rule-breaking or risk-taking behavior compared to older adults.
Ah, the developing teenage brain. Explains a lot.
It plays a role, but it's not purely a cold, logical process. Emotional centers, like the amygdala,
Fear and emotion.
and reward systems in the basal ganglia are constantly interacting with the PFC. Our decisions about whether to follow a rule aren't just based on understanding it. They involve valuing the potential outcome, desiring social approval, or fearing consequences.
So is logic plus feelings plus rewards.
Pretty much. If these emotional or reward areas are dysregulated, the sources suggest it can increase the likelihood of violations.
So our brains are built to handle rules, and there's an emotional component. Psychologically, what compels us to actually follow rules most of the time?
We are profoundly social creatures, and conformity is a massive driver.
Just wanting to fit in.
That's a big part of it. The sources bring up Harvard psychologist Herbert Kellman's work describing 3 types of social influence that drive us to conform.
Okay.
There's compliance,
Yeah.
where you outwardly follow the rule but privately disagree, just going along.
Right.
Then identification, where you conform because you identify with the social role or group you admire. You want to be like them. And finally, internalization, the deepest level, where you genuinely accept the rule's underlying beliefs and values as your own. It becomes part of you.
Internalization sounds like the most robust kind of rule following, the one that really sticks.
It tends to be. Beyond these, there's the fundamental human need to belong. We crave social acceptance and fear rejection, which powerfully pushes us to align with group norms and rules.
And rules make life easier, right? Less chaotic.
Absolutely. Rules provide a crucial sense of order, predictability, and security, reducing anxiety in complex environments. And let's be honest, in a complicated world, following established rules is often a valuable cognitive shortcut. It simplifies decision-making dramatically.
Instead of having to figure out the best way to behave in every single situation, we just follow the known pattern.
Exactly. It makes social interactions much smoother and more efficient. But
there's a downside.
There can be. The sources are careful to point out the potential downside. This drive for conformity and using rules as shortcuts can lead to unthinking compliance, even with rules that might be unfair or unjust, especially if the social pressure to conform is intense.
Okay, we've talked about why we follow rules, but rule breaking is just as universal a human behavior. Let's talk about the science behind that. Why do we deviate from the expected path?
This is where human decision-making gets really interesting and often, a bit messy. The sources emphasize that our decisions aren't purely rational. They're heavily influenced by cognitive biases.
Those mental shortcuts or glitches.
Right. Those systematic ways our thinking deviates from pure logic and heuristics. The mental shortcuts we use to make quick judgments.
Can you give me some examples of how these biases lead to breaking rules?
Sure. The sources list several relatable ones. Think about confirmation bias. If you already think a rule is stupid or unfair, you're probably only going to notice and seek out information that confirms that belief.
And ignore anything that contradicts it.
Exactly. Or anchoring bias. Maybe your first interaction with a rule was negative, and you just stay anchored to that initial bad impression, making it hard to see the rule positively later.
Okay.
The availability heuristic. If everyone you know speeds on a certain road and seems to get away with it, you might overestimate how safe you are from getting caught just because that successful outcome is easily available in your mind.
Right. You think it won't happen to me.
Which ties into optimism bias, simply underestimating your own personal chance of negative consequences, like getting caught, and the framing effect. You might be more likely to break a rule if it's framed in a certain way.
How so?
Perhaps as bending the rules to get the job done rather than violating regulations. It sounds less bad.
So it's not necessarily malice. It's often just our brains taking faulty shortcuts.
That's a significant part of it. These biases contribute to what's called bounded rationality. We're not perfect rule-calculating machines.
Right.
The sources suggest a certain amount of rule-breaking is statistically predictable simply because of these inherent cognitive limitations we all share.
And AI might help spot these biases.
Potentially. AI, by analyzing vast data sets of decisions or behaviors, could potentially detect patterns that reveal these cognitive biases at play, perhaps in how rules are applied or interpreted.
What about emotions? Do feelings push us towards breaking rules?
Absolutely. Emotions play a huge, often underestimated role. Anger, frustration, or resentment fueled by a perception of injustice can powerfully overguide rational compliance.
Or just being bored.
Boredom, too, can lead to seeking thrills that involve breaking rules. The sources describe this as a dynamic conflict happening in the brain between the automatic tendency to follow the learned rule and the pull of desire or negative emotion to violate it.
And we're pretty good at justifying our actions after we break a rule, right?
Yeah.
Making excuses.
Incredibly good. We have mechanisms of moral disengagement that allow us to violate our own internal moral standards without feeling too much guilt or cognitive dissonance.
How does that work?
It involves techniques like reframing the behavior. I wasn't stealing, I was just borrowing. Minimizing the perceived harm, nobody really got hurt, or blaming the victim, they shouldn't have left their stuff out. In group or organizational settings, things like cultural numbness, where unethical practices become normal and invisible, or justified neglect, seeing rules as merely obstructive obstacles, also contribute.
It sounds like a pressure cooker building up, all these frustrations.
The sources use a kind of hydraulic pressure model for this. Unmet needs, strong negative emotions, or a perception of injustice build up pressure.
Okay.
If the rule system doesn't provide legitimate, acceptable ways to address this pressure channels for protest, feedback, or addressing grievances, that pressure can rupture in rule violations.
So breaking the rules like letting off steam.
Sometimes. These violations can actually signal that there's a significant misalignment between the existing rules and human needs or experiences.
But you said rule breaking isn't always a negative thing. The sources suggest rebellion can be constructive.
They definitely do. Rebellion, defined broadly as pushing against established ideals, attitudes, or rules, can be a powerful catalyst for social change and innovation.
How so?
People rebel for various reasons. Their deeply held beliefs might conflict with existing rules. They might want to differentiate themselves and forge a unique identity, or they might be seeking belonging within a counterculture group that challenges the status quo.
Like the civil rights movement or paradigm shifts in scientific understanding. Those were about breaking established norms.
Perfect examples. Those were fundamentally challenges to existing rules, norms, and ways of thinking. The sources frame this kind of rule breaking as an evolutionary mechanism for rule systems themselves.
Like mutations in biology.
Sort of. Much like mutations can test a species' fitness, principled dissent or actions that highlight the flaws or injustices of a rule can test that rule's resilience.
And how the system responds is key.
Exactly. Does it rigidly suppress, grudgingly accommodate, or actively reform? That determines if the rule system adapts and evolves or becomes brittle and stagnant. Constructive challenge can expose outdated assumptions and force a necessary reevaluation, potentially leading to more just and functional rules.
This interaction between order and challenge, following and breaking rules, it almost sounds like it has elements of chaos in it. Does chaos theory apply here?
The sources explore applying concepts from chaos theory to social systems. These are complex, nonlinear systems where small changes can sometimes lead to disproportionately large and unpredictable outcomes.
The butterfly effect.
Right, that's the classic idea. Rule breaking, especially widespread or novel forms of it, can be seen as a manifestation of this inherent complexity. Even seemingly minor infractions, if they spread or interact in unexpected ways, could cascade through the system unpredictably.
So you can't always perfectly predict the long-term outcome of a new rule or a wave of rule breaking.
Not with absolute certainty. Chaos theory also talks about attractors.
Attractors.
States or patterns that a system tends to settle into or be pulled towards. In legal systems, things like the power of the law itself, state authority, and established norms act as attractors, pulling behavior towards regularity and order.
Keeping things stable.
Exactly. The sources suggest that healthy, resilient social systems often operate at the edge of chaos.
The edge of chaos sounds precarious.
It's a dynamic state that balances order and predictability with randomness and flexibility. It's inherently potentially unstable, yes, but it's also where the greatest potential for adaptation, learning, and innovation lies.
It sounds like a really fine line between having enough challenge to adapt and having so much that everything falls apart.
It is. Excessive, unconstrained transgression or conflict can lead to social entropy.
Social entropy, breakdown.
Essentially the breakdown and collapse of complex social structures. But the opposite extreme, excessive rigidity and lack of challenge, prevents the adaptation necessary to survive changing circumstances.
And AI might help model this balance.
AI modeling could potentially help identify this edge of chaos in complex social systems, maybe suggesting optimal levels of flexibility needed to encourage positive evolution without risking collapse.
So rules are woven into our biology, our minds, and they shape our behavior in incredibly complex ways, sometimes leading us to follow, sometimes to break. Let's talk about their larger impact. How do they shape the world around us, from the individual to the global stage? How do rules affect us personally?
Rules have a profound impact on our personal well-being. Just and predictable rules create a sense of security and order, and that's essential.
For feeling safe, planning ahead.
Exactly. It allows you to plan for the future, pursue goals, and generally feel safe in your environment. On the flip side, unjust, arbitrary, or oppressive rules are incredibly stifling.
Yeah, they can feel awful.
They reduce autonomy, kill creativity, and cause significant frustration, resentment, and stress.
Like feeling constantly watched or being overwhelmed by complex, pointless regulations. That feeling of helplessness.
Exactly. The psychological toll of feeling constantly under surveillance or trying to navigate opaque, inconsistent rules can be huge.
But no rules is bad too, right?
Right. The sources also note that the absence of clear rules, a state sometimes called anomie, can also be incredibly anxiety-inducing and frightening. They suggest there's an optimal rule load for individuals and societies.
That's a sweet spot.
Yeah, finding that sweet spot. Too few rules lead to chaos and insecurity, But too many, or rules that are too strict, create a kind of gilded cage, offering safety at the cost of freedom and vitality.
Finding that balance between chaos and being overly constrained.
That's the idea. And AI potentially could help us understand this better by analyzing large data sets correlating different rule environments with well-being indicators.
Like stress levels or mental health data.
Right. Or even measures of creativity and innovation. AI might help identify patterns related to this optimal balance in different contexts.
What about the impact of rules at the community level? How do they shape our towns or neighborhoods?
At the community level, rules and shared norms are the fundamental bedrock of social cohesion, trust, and cooperation.
The glue that holds things together.
In a way, yes. When people share an understanding of the rules and believe they are applied fairly, interactions are smoother, and it's much easier to work together towards common goals. As we mentioned earlier, shared belief systems, like religion, historically played a key role in cementing this kind of group coherence.
The rules also seem to be a major source of conflict within communities. People argue about them all the time.
Absolutely. Disputes over interpreting rules or perceptions of unfair application are constant sources of internal strife. Rules also inherently define who is part of the group and who isn't. Following the rules signals membership and strengthens internal bonds among those who adhere.
And if you break them,
violating core rules can lead to social sanctions, ostracism, or exclusion. While this strengthens the in-group, it can also create or worsen tensions between different communities that operate by different rule sets or interpret shared rules differently.
okay, scaling up. What's the impact on entire societies? Countries, nations?
Effective, just, and adaptable rule systems are presented in the sources as fundamental prerequisites for societal flourishing.
How so?
Think about legal frameworks that protect property rights, enforce contracts, ensure fair competition. These are absolutely vital for enabling economic development, fostering innovation, and allowing complex institutions to function.
Okay.
Comparative studies even suggest links between the origins of a society's legal system, like common law versus civil law, and its long-term economic outcomes.
So rules aren't just constraints. They're the very foundation that allows a complex economy or society to operate.
They provide the necessary structure and predictability. Natural law theory, as we discussed, sees law as a remedy against anarchy and tyranny, essential for achieving the common good.
And the opposite, bad rules.
Conversely, dysfunctional, corrupt, or unjust rule systems are recipes for disaster. They lead to declining public trust, economic stagnation, internal conflict, and ultimately that social entropy, the potential for societal collapse.
So a society's resilience really depends on its rule systems being able to adapt over time, not being too rigid.
Critically, rigid systems are brittle. They can't respond to changing circumstances or internal pressures. The capacity for rules to evolve, to learn from feedback, and to be reformed is a hallmark of resilient, long-lasting societies.
And AI could model that resilience.
Potentially, yeah. AI could model different stressors on a society's stability and offer insights into where rule systems might be too rigid or too fragile.
And rules extend beyond national borders, right, to the global stage, international law and things like that.
They absolutely do, through international law, diplomatic agreements, trade treaties, and the development of transnational norms. A cornerstone of this is the concept of universal human rights.
Like the UDHR.
Right, like those outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are seen as inherent to all people, simply by virtue of being human, regardless of nationality or status.
It goes back to older ideas, too.
Yes, the historical idea of ins gentium, the ancient Roman concept of a law of peoples that applied to all regardless of citizenship, was an early precursor to this universalist thinking.
But implementing universal rules internationally must face enormous challenges. Different cultures, different governments.
It is incredibly challenging. You have vastly different cultural interpretations, diverse political systems, competing national interests, different levels of economic development. It's complex.
Yeah.
There's a constant translation problem. How do you apply abstract universal principles like human rights in incredibly diverse cultural contexts?
For example?
Well, balancing universal standards with respecting cultural practices raises complex questions all the time.
So global effectiveness relies heavily on navigating that complex translation and finding common ground, without just imposing one view.
Exactly. It requires fostering a shared understanding, managing inevitable disagreements, and finding ways to apply principles that respect diversity while upholding core tenets like fundamental human dignity.
And AI might help bridge those gaps.
The sources suggest that AI tools for comparative legal analysis, cross-cultural communication, or mapping different interpretive frameworks might potentially help bridge some of these complex interpretive gaps. It's a possibility.
When we talk about whether rules are just or whether they should be universal, we're naturally moving into questions of ethics. How do the sources suggest we judge if a rule is right or wrong?
Right, the ethical dimension. This requires frameworks for evaluating rules beyond just whether they are legally enacted. The sources introduce key ethical theories that help us think about this.
Okay, like what?
One is deontology, which focuses on duty, rights, and universal moral principles.
Like Kant.
Yeah, think Kant's categorical imperative. This approach judges a rule by whether it adheres to those principles like honesty, fairness, or respect for rights, regardless of the outcome. The intent and the principle matter most.
So is the rule inherently fair or right in its content?
Yes. Contrast that with consequentialism, like utilitarianism.
Which focuses on results.
Exactly. This approach judges a rule based on its outcomes or consequences. Does it produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Here, the ends can potentially be seen as justifying the means if the outcome is beneficial enough.
So results are the main thing you look at, what actually happens.
And then there's virtue ethics, which focuses on moral character.
Like Aristotle.
Right. It asks whether a rule promotes virtuous behavior in individuals or is consistent with the character of a good, flourishing society. What would a person with practical wisdom and good character create or support?
So you need to consider duty and principle, the results, and whether it fosters good character. Seems like a lot.
The sources note that a comprehensive ethical evaluation of a rule often benefits from drawing insights from all three perspectives. As each offers a valuable but incomplete lens, you often need to look at it from all angles.
Beyond these broad theories, what are the specific things that make a rule feel just and give it legitimacy in people's eyes?
Building on traditions like natural law, the sources argue that an unjust law isn't fully legitimate, even if it's technically legal. Legitimacy itself is described as multidimensional, deeply tied to how fair a rule is perceived to be.
Okay, so what are the dimensions?
There's substantive justice. Is the actual content of the rule fair? Is it reasonable? Then procedural justice was the process for making and enforcing the rule fair and transparent. Do people have a voice or feel like they were treated fairly?
Right, the process matters.
Hugely. And finally, distributive justice. Are the outcomes or burdens and benefits of the rule distributed fairly among different groups, or does it disproportionately harm some?
So legitimacy isn't just about whether it was passed legally, but whether it feels fair in its substance, in how it was created and enforced, and in its effects on different people.
Precisely. A breakdown in any of these areas, if the content feels unfair, the process was rigged, or the outcomes are unequal, erodes public trust and cooperation, making rules harder to maintain.
Let's think about the ethical considerations throughout the entire life of a rule, from creation to enforcement and response. It's not just about the rule itself.
No, it's the whole life cycle. In the design phase, there's an ethical responsibility to make rules clear, understandable, and to actively avoid building in biases, whether personal or systemic, from existing practices.
Like using good data if it's a health rule.
Exactly. Using sound scientific evidence for something like health regulations is also an ethical requirement. In enforcement, ethical demands are for impartiality, proportionality.
Fitting the punishment to the crime, basically.
Yeah, right. Fitting the response to the violation and consistency. Enforcement that is biased, even unconsciously, fundamentally undermines justice. And new technologies, like using neuroscience evidence in legal settings, bring up complex new ethical questions here.
And how society responds when someone breaks a rule. Punishment versus helping them.
That involves fundamental ethical choices, too. Is the primary goal punishment, rehabilitation, or restorative justice focused on repairing harm? Concepts like forgiveness and redemption also come into play.
So it's a whole chain of ethical decisions.
The sources frame this as life cycle ethics. To judge a rule fully, you look at its intent, how it's applied, how it's enforced, how society responds to violations, and whether the system is willing to reform the rule if it proves unjust or ineffective.
Can we use a specific example to make this clear? The sources mention the question of a mandatory retirement age for public officials, like elected representatives or judges. How do the ethical frameworks look at that?
That's a great case study for balancing competing claims. Arguments for a mandatory age often point to concerns about potential cognitive or physical decline impacting performance.
That's a consequentialist argument, right?
Yeah.
About the outcome.
Exactly. Focus on ensuring effective governance and protecting the public interest. There's also the idea of facilitating generational turnover for fresh perspectives, which touches on fairness and renewal.
And the arguments against?
Arguments against highlight the loss of immense experience and wisdom when highly capable individuals are forced out a negative consequence. They argue that a single chronological age is an imperfect proxy for individual ability.
So it's potentially unfair to individuals.
Right, and that mandatory retirement is essentially ageism discrimination based on age alone. That's a strong deontological concern about treating individuals fairly based on their own merits, not group averages.
Are there alternatives?
Alternatives like regular objective competency tests are suggested to respect individual capacity while still addressing the performance concerns.
So the rule has to navigate balancing the consequentialist goal of effective government with the deontological principle of non-discrimination and valuing the virtue of wisdom or experience. It's tricky.
Exactly. Rules like this have to grapple with these competing claims and values. The sources suggest that ethically, rules might favor more nuanced, functional criteria like performance evaluations over arbitrary cutoffs based solely on age.
And AI might help assess fitness, but the ethical choice remains human.
Right. While AI might eventually help assess individual fitness in the future, the core ethical responsibility for designing rules that navigate these values ultimately remains a human one.
This brings us back to AI. We've touched on its potential role in understanding or improving aspects of rule systems. But how might AI fundamentally change how we interact with rules and governance in the future?
AI holds tremendous potential here, both exciting and, well, challenging. Human rule systems, as we've seen, are incredibly complex.
Yeah, lots of moving parts.
Many interacting components, feedback loops, often nonlinear behavior. AI, particularly with machine learning and complex systems modeling capabilities, is uniquely powerful for analyzing and helping us understand this complexity.
How so?
It can enhance those models of social evolution, game theory, and chaos theory we discussed with vastly more data and variables than humans could ever process, simulating how rules emerge, spread, and stabilize.
Like building incredibly detailed simulations of how societies with different rules might behave, seeing what works.
In a sense, applying chaos theory via AI could potentially help identify patterns, critical thresholds, or leverage points within social systems that influence rule dynamics. AI is already actively shaping norms and interactions on digital platforms, for instance.
Wow.
The sources describe AI as a kind of computational socioscope.
A what?
A computational socioscope, a tool that allows us to visualize and analyze the complex dynamics of how rules interact with human behavior in society on a scale never before possible, potentially revealing emergent properties or unintended consequences.
Like seeing the hidden effects of a rule.
Exactly. Imagine AI modeling the full impact of a new environmental regulation across different industries, communities, and ecological systems, seeing the ripples.
So beyond just understanding, how could AI specifically improve rule systems themselves, make them better?
The potential applications are vast. AI could help design genuinely better rules.
Oh.
By analyzing historical data on the effectiveness of past rules, or by simulating the potential impact of a proposed new rule on different demographics before it's enacted.
Testing it first.
Right. AI could help us create rules that are more adaptive, more equitable, and ultimately more effective at achieving their goals. This vision is sometimes called responsive, accountable governance enabled by AI.
Making rules fairer and more effective from the very beginning. That sounds good.
Yes. AI could also significantly enhance transparency and accountability within governance.
Like keeping track of things.
It could track changes to laws and regulations, analyze potential influences like lobbying data, provide clear, understandable explanations of complex laws to citizens, or audit government actions for compliance. It could even help build and manage co-governance platforms that facilitate more direct citizen participation in rulemaking.
And what about that human bias we discussed earlier that creeps into decision-making? Can AI help there?
It might. AI could potentially help mitigate human cognitive biases in applying rules. It could act as a decision support tool for judges, policymakers, or administrators, flagging potential bias patterns in past decisions.
Like a warning system.
Or it could serve as a kind of digital devil's advocate, presenting alternative interpretations or reminding decision-makers of rules that might be overlooked. It could even facilitate blind reviews of applications or cases to reduce demographic bias.
And helping people actually understand and follow rules in their daily lives. making it less confusing.
That's another key area. AI could power personalized rule information systems, explaining complex regulations in language tailored to an individual specific situation.
That would be helpful.
It could enable more targeted and effective public awareness campaigns about important rules. It could even provide personalized feedback to nudge compliance, like a reminder about recycling rules specific to your neighborhood.
A personal rule assistant.
The sources even propose the concept of a personalized rule navigator, an AI system designed to help individuals navigate the increasingly complex web of rules relevant to their own lives, from taxes to local ordinances, potentially improving adherence and empowering citizens.
That does sound like it could make life much smoother, but it also brings up some significant questions and potential downsides. What are the big ethical challenges of bringing AI into governance? This sounds powerful.
It is powerful, and this is the double-edged sword aspect. There are major risks that need to be addressed proactively. Algorithmic bias is a huge one.
How does that happen?
If the data AI is trained on reflects existing societal biases, racial, gender, economic, the AI will learn, perpetuate, and even amplify those biases when applying rules, leading to discriminatory outcomes in areas like justice, finance, or social services.
So it just learns our existing problems and makes them worse if we're not careful.
That's the risk if not carefully managed. There's also the problem of opacity and lack of accountability, the black box issue.
Can't see inside.
Right. It can be difficult or impossible to understand why a complex AI system made a particular decision based on rules, which makes holding anyone accountable very difficult. We need explainable and auditable AI systems in governance contexts.
Okay. What else?
Surveillance and the erosion of privacy is another major concern. Data-hungry AI systems can incentivize constant monitoring of citizens, creating a chilling effect on behavior. You might change what you do if you think an AI is always watching.
And is there a risk it replaces human judgment entirely? Takes over.
There's a concern about the erosion of human autonomy and discretion. Over-reliance on AI for applying rules could diminish the vital role of human judgment, empathy, and nuance that is often necessary for achieving just outcomes in complex individual cases.
Because AI just applies the rule rigidly.
It's powerful at applying rules rigidly, but human situations are often messy and require that human touch, that understanding.
So it feels like humanity is at a choice point regarding AI and rules. Which way do we go?
The sources frame it as a fundamental societal choice. Do we head towards an algorithmic panopticon, a future of pervasive, potentially biased, automated control?
Doesn't sound good.
Or do we strive for algorithmic justice where ethically designed and deployed AI enhances fairness, transparency, and equity within rule systems? It demands very proactive ethical design, robust safeguards, and constant human oversight. We have to choose wisely.
This entire topic, covering evolution, history, philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, economics, and AI, it highlights how interdisciplinary understanding human rules needs to be. Are new fields emerging because of this?
Yes, absolutely. Fields like neurolaw are emerging.
Neurolaw.
Yeah, combining insights from neuroscience, law, philosophy, and psychology to understand how brain science impacts legal standards, questions of responsibility, or even crime prediction.
Oh, wow.
The sources see AI as a powerful catalyst for what's sometimes called consilience, the convergence of knowledge from seemingly disparate disciplines. The quest for a science of human rules is about finding unifying theories for how humans interact with normative systems, moving beyond fragmented perspectives to a more integrated understanding that draws on biology, neuro, psycho, socio, eco, history, law, and computation, bringing it all together.
So recapping our journey today, it's really shown that rules aren't just external limits imposed upon us. They are deeply woven into our very biology, the way our minds work, and the fundamental fabric of our societies.
Absolutely. Looking at this through the lens of an AI-informed science of human rules offers powerful new insights into this complex interplay.
Seeing rules as essential information and control systems.
Right, systems that allow us to coordinate and cooperate. But it also reminds us that these systems are inherently imperfect, precisely because they are created and inhabited by imperfect humans.
There's that constant necessary tension between the needs of individual agency and the need for collective order. Always a balancing act.
And that relationship between humanity and its rules is dynamic, constantly evolving. Human nature constantly tests, probes, and reshapes these systems through interpretation, challenge, and even violation.
Our agency means rules aren't static commands. They're living entities that must be adaptable to survive.
Exactly.
It's a fundamental paradox, isn't it? Rules are, by definition, constraints. They limit what we can do. But paradoxically, they're also essential enablers of our greatest potential.
How so?
Well, without rules, you descend into chaos and insecurity, which makes any complex project, building cities, conducting scientific research, establishing trade, basically impassable.
Right. Anarchy doesn't build things.
But when rules are crafted wisely and applied justly, they provide the security, trust, and frameworks for cooperation that enable all those amazing human achievements.
They empower us collectively in ways chaos would dismantle us individually. It's the structure that allows freedom, in a way.
And our sources mentioned your query, the one about rules for a healthy, normal, and prosperous human society and a balanced universe, especially our home, the Earth.
Yeah, thinking about the big picture, environment, food, recycling, all of it.
Well, this abstract science of human rules and the potential of AI we've discussed connect directly to those concrete, pressing global challenges.
How?
Navigating things like climate change, resource scarcity, or ensuring sustainable food systems absolutely requires intelligently designed, ethically applied, and continuously adapted rule systems, local, national, and international.
We need good rules to solve those problems.
Rules are critical for achieving that healthy future and for being responsible stewards of our planet. AI can be an incredibly valuable ally in this, helping us understand complexity and design better systems.
If we wield it responsibly.
Exactly. Carefully navigating the ethical challenges to ensure it augments human dignity and democratic values rather than undermining them.
The quest to understand and perfect our rule systems feels fundamental to navigating our shared destiny on this planet. It's an ongoing project.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider as you reflect on this deep dive. Given the immense potential benefits, but also the significant ethical risks of bringing powerful AI into this ancient human endeavor, the creation and management of rules, what kind of future rule systems do you believe humanity needs to strive for?
Yeah, what's needed to achieve that healthy, prosperous society and a balanced universe you envision? What role should AI play, and how do we keep it aligned with our best values? Something to really think about.
This is DigitView.